cities to tornadoes one day, South Africa never forgot what happened. In October 2011, an unprecedented meteorological phenomenon shook the country. Without sirens, without warnings, without escape, two communities were trapped under the fury of a sky that had become an enemy. First, it was Duduza, a poor neighborhood east of Johannesburg, where a colossal windstorm ripped off roofs, uprooted homes, and left hundreds of families in ruins. Just hours later, another town, Vicksburg, more than 200 kilometers away, faced its own tormentor. A second tornado, equally destructive. Two tragedies, one day. The coincidence seemed impossible, but nature knows no bounds. What happens when a country without warning systems faces a monster from the sky? This is the story of a double disaster that forever changed South Africa's perception of the weather. South Africa, a land of contrasts. A country where mountains rise like ancient guardians over open plains, where deserts, savannas, and coasts intertwine in an imposing natural mosaic. Here, the sun beats down, the rains fall unevenly, and the winds travel for miles without encountering barriers. However, amid all these nuances, there is something rarely associated with this region: tornadoes. Unlike the United States, where the so-called Tornado Alley concentrates hundreds of events each year, South Africa is in a very different situation. Its weather systems typically bring intense thunderstorms during the spring and summer. Yes, but the formation of supercells capable of generating tornadoes is much less frequent. And when they do occur, they are usually on a smaller scale, with short-lived funnels affecting small areas. That's why what happened in October 2011 took everyone by surprise. The explanation lies in the geography and climate of that time of year. October marks the beginning of spring in the southern hemisphere. Temperatures begin to rise rapidly after winter, and the atmosphere becomes charged with energy. The warmth of the ground contrasts with cold air currents at altitude, a dangerous combination for the stability of the sky. On that day, moisture from the Indian Ocean met warm air masses rising from the continental interior. This collision created gigantic clouds that not only unleashed rain and hail, but also evolved into something even more fearsome: supercells. These rotating storms are the architects of the most violent tornadoes on the planet. The extraordinary thing is that in South Africa, there was no, and still is not to the same extent, a robust early warning system for such extreme phenomena. Unlike other regions of the world, where specialized radars track every storm cell and authorities can activate sirens minutes in advance, in communities like Duduza and Vicksburg, there was no warning at all. For most residents, the dark clouds only seemed to herald heavy rain. No one imagined that within those turbulent masses, the sky was preparing a double blow. What happened that day is the result of a rare alignment of factors: abundant moisture, sheer winds that rotated the storms, and enough convective energy for the atmosphere to unleash its fury. The result: two devastating tornadoes in a country that was never prepared for them. South Africa has always been a place where nature sets its own rhythm, from prolonged droughts to torrential rains. But that October made something more disturbing clear. Even in lands where tornadoes are rare, unpredictable weather can turn into an unexpected monster. That was the backdrop for a day that would go down in history, and it was in Duduza where it all began. It was Sunday, October 9th, 2011. In the town of Duduza, less than an hour east of Johannesburg, life went on as usual. Families were preparing lunch, children were playing in the dusty streets, and the spring air brought with it the promise of scattered showers. No one, absolutely no one, could have imagined that the sky was about to change their lives forever. By mid-afternoon, the clouds began to darken with disconcerting speed. The wind blew harder than usual, and deep thunder rumbled like distant warnings. For most, it was just another storm, the kind that comes with spring. But at the heart of those clouds, something far more deadly was brewing. A rotating supercell that would soon transform into a tornado of devastating force. Just after 3 in the afternoon, the first signs of chaos appeared. Witnesses report that the sky took on a greenish hue, an unnatural color that filled those watching with fear. The wind roared with an increasingly high-pitched whistling, and then, without warning, a funnel descended from the clouds like a dark whip that touched the ground in a matter of seconds. The tornado struck Duduza, a community characterized by modest homes, many of them built with hollow bricks, tin roofs, and fragile materials. The storm met no resistance. It ripped off roofs like sheets of paper, toppled entire walls, and lifted heavy objects into the air like toys. I heard a roar like a train that never stopped, one survivor recounted. I ran inside the house, but in a matter of seconds the roof disappeared over our heads. Everything collapsed. The tragedy reached its most painful point when it was learned that a girl, barely 9 years old, had lost her life. Her family tearfully recounted how they tried to cover her with blankets as the walls crumbled, but nothing could stop the fury of the wind. Her death became a symbol of a disaster that left an indelible scar on the community. More than 160 homes were reduced to rubble in a matter of minutes. Hundreds of people were injured, some with serious fractures after being struck by flying debris. Nearby hospitals collapsed under the flood of injured people arriving with cuts, bruises, and broken bones. One resident recalled being blown several meters by the force of the wind. There was nowhere to hide. I ran, but I felt the air lifting me up. I closed my eyes and just prayed. When I opened my eyes, I was standing amidst broken bricks and twisted iron. I didn't know if I was alive or dead. The most dramatic aspect was how the informal settlements of Duduza, built with precarious materials, were reduced to nothing. There, where poverty forces people to improvise housing with wood, sheet metal, and plastic, the tornado swept through mercilessly. Structures were blown away, leaving entire families exposed to the wind and rain in a matter of seconds. Neighbors helped each other out of the wreckage. Parents desperately searched for their children, while others roamed the streets shouting the names of relatives and friends. The confusion was total. There were no sirens, no time to take shelter. People reacted as best they could. Some threw themselves to the ground and covered themselves with blankets. Others ran to nearby churches or schools, seeking more solid walls. But in many cases, the tornado was faster than any attempt to escape. When the tornado finally dissipated, what was left behind resembled a war zone. Streets littered with debris, downed power poles, overturned cars like toys. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the cries for help that emerged from the wreckage. First responders described scenes of horror, families trapped under collapsed walls, children crying amid the rubble, and disoriented adults walking through what had once been their homes. The air smelled of dust, dampness, and fear. A volunteer firefighter recalled, "I'd never seen anything like this. It was as if the wind had decided to wipe Duduza off the map. We'd arrive at a street and it simply wouldn't exist anymore." Amid the chaos, solidarity also emerged. Neighbors who barely knew each other began digging with their bare hands to free those trapped. Women improvised shelters with salvaged tarps, while young people rushed to community centers to organize aid. The South African Red Cross arrived shortly after, distributing blankets and food, but the first heroes were the residents of Duduza themselves. The community, battered to its core, demonstrated a resilience that impressed the entire country. The most disturbing thing was the complete lack of warning. In countries like the United States, people usually have 10 to 20 minutes notice to seek shelter. In Duduza, there wasn't a single warning. The tornado struck suddenly, highlighting how vulnerable the population was to a phenomenon of this magnitude. That lack of warning systems turned a storm into a tragedy. And the lesson was bitter. Extreme weather no longer respected borders or statistics. Today, more than a decade later, those who lived through that day remember it with chills. Most agree in describing it with the same words. It was as if the heavens opened up and decided to swallow everything. The Duduza tornado wasn't the largest or longest lasting in the world, but its human impact in a place lacking preparation and protection made it an unforgettable event. That afternoon, Duduza learned the hard way that even the most unlikely corners of the planet can fall victim to the wind's fury. And while the city struggled to rise from the ruins, hundreds of miles away, another community faced a similar fate. Vicksburg was about to experience its own personal hell, while in Duduza, people were still trying to comprehend what had happened, while the improvised sirens of ambulances and police cars crossed streets covered in dust and debris. The sky was preparing a new ambush. Hundreds of kilometers to the south in the town of Vicksburg, another storm was brewing with the same fury, as if nature had decided to launch a second challenge on the same day. Vicksburg is a farming town near the border with Lesotho, known for its fertile fields and cherry production, which attracts visitors every year during the spring festivals. A peaceful place, with modest houses and a slow pace, where life revolves around the land and the harvest. But on that October 9th, 2011, the tranquility disappeared under a blackened sky that foretold a storm. The afternoon had begun with thick, humid air permeating the region. Farmers watched as the clouds grew into dark towers that seemed to move with a life of their own. The wind blew erratically, sometimes in strong gusts, sometimes eerily silent. Residents looked up in resignation, convinced it was a severe thunderstorm, perhaps with hail, like so many others they had endured. But soon, that sense of normalcy shattered. The wind changed pitch, taking on a deep roar that many compared to the sound of an approaching train. The clouds began to swirl, and within seconds, a dark funnel descended from the sky and touched down. A tornado was born, and its target was the heart of Vicksburg. The impact was brutal. The funnel advanced like a wall of wind, lifting roofs, uprooting trees, and battering everything in its path with disconcerting violence. Unlike Duduza, where very precarious housing predominated, in Vicksburg many houses had more solid walls, but even that wasn't enough to resist. Glass exploded inward like projectiles, walls shook, and some structures collapsed under the pressure of the wind. Cars were lifted and thrown against utility poles or fences, and streets were blocked by downed branches and wires. Eyewitness accounts from that day speak of indescribable chaos. A woman working in a small shop recounted that, in a matter of seconds, the roof lifted off and blew away, leaving customers exposed to rain and debris. A group of schoolchildren was trapped when the wind ripped open classroom doors, sending glass scything down around them. Desperate teachers tried to cover the children with their own bodies until the tornado moved on. Within a few hours, the local hospital received dozens of injured people with deep cuts, fractured bones, and bruises caused by objects flying like missiles. Emergency crews in Vicksburg, as in Duduza, lacked specific training to deal with a tornado of this magnitude. Without advanced radar systems or warning sirens, residents had to face the fury of the wind without any advance warning. When first responders arrived in the hardest hit areas, they found a scene of destruction that looked like something out of a movie. Homes reduced to piles of bricks, overturned vehicles, and uprooted trees. And amidst all this, disoriented people covered in dust and blood, searching for family and friends among the wreckage. What was most striking was the simultaneity of the disaster. As national newscasts began broadcasting images of the devastation in Duduza, another wave of reports poured in from Vicksburg, confirming that the country was facing an unprecedented double blow. South Africa, a territory where tornadoes were considered isolated rarities, had suffered two major events on the same day. The feeling of disbelief was mixed with anguish because there was no way of knowing if the nightmare would end there or if new storms would hit other communities. The disaster in Vicksburg also left a deep emotional mark. Many families lost their homes. Others were left with physical and psychological scars that would take years to heal. Farmers saw their crops destroyed in minutes, losing an entire season's work. Streets, littered with downed power lines and fragments of zinc roofing, became hazardous areas where the danger didn't end with the tornado's passage. Local rescuers worked side by side with neighbors to free people trapped in the rubble. In some cases, they had to dig with makeshift shovels, in others, simply with their bare hands. Human chains were organized to remove bricks and wood while someone listened attentively for the cries or screams of a survivor on the other side. Each rescue was a race against time. Every minute counted. A paramedic recalled finding an injured woman clutching her baby in the wreckage of a collapsed house. The mother had fractures in both legs, but had managed to cover the child with her own body during the tornado's passage. The scene became a symbol of hope amid so much destruction. The arrival of nightfall brought no relief. With the power cut off, the city was left in darkness, illuminated only by the emergency lights of rescue vehicles. The rain continued to fall, hampering search efforts and increasing the risk of collapse in damaged structures. Residents, fearful that another tornado might appear out of nowhere, spent the night awake, sheltering in churches, schools, and community centers. By dawn, the magnitude of the tragedy was evident. Vicksburg had changed in a few hours. What had once been a peaceful farming town was now a field of ruins. Yet, amid the grief and uncertainty, a spirit of solidarity reminiscent of Duduza also emerged. Neighbors sharing food, volunteers traveling from other towns to help, doctors working tirelessly to care for the wounded. The entire country was moved to see how two communities, geographically distant but united by tragedy, faced the same fate with courage. The Vicksburg tornado wasn't just the other blow of that day. It was confirmation that South Africa had entered a new climate reality. These were no longer isolated phenomena or statistical oddities. What happened in October 2011 showed that the country had to prepare for the unthinkable. What happened on that Sunday in October 2011 was not only devastating for its human and material impact, it also baffled meteorologists and scientists because, statistically speaking, the probability of two tornadoes hitting two South African cities on the same day seemed almost impossible. It was such an unusual phenomenon that it left the entire country wondering, how rare was this, really? South Africa, unlike regions like the central United States, is not known for its tornado activity. Tornadoes do occur, but they tend to be few, brief, and of moderate intensity. Meteorological studies indicate that the country can record an average of 1 to 3 dozen tornadoes per year, although most occur in sparsely populated areas, populated rural areas, and rarely reach high levels. To gauge the rarity, compare it with the United States, where in some years more than 1,200 recorded events occur. The difference is vast. Another country with some activity is Brazil, which, due to its size and tropical climate, also records dozens of tornadoes each year, especially in the south. Italy, in Europe, has experienced violent tornadoes near the Mediterranean, although in much smaller numbers. In all these cases, however, there are historical records, warning systems, and a social perception that tornadoes, although unpredictable, are part of the climate landscape. In South Africa, on the other hand, the collective imagination never considered facing a similar scenario possible. The Duduza and Vicksburg events decisively shattered that perception. Never before in the country's modern history had a double tornado outbreak been documented, affecting urban areas separated by hundreds of kilometers on such a massive scale. For scientists, this was a warning sign. Southern Africa's climate was not exempt from extreme events, and the combination of atmospheric factors could reproduce conditions similar to those in other parts of the world. Statistics show that the majority of tornadoes in South Africa occur in the provinces of Free State, Gauteng, and KwaZulu-Natal. Both Duduza and Vicksburg are precisely within these prone areas, although historically the magnitude of the events has been much smaller. The simultaneity was most disconcerting. Two active supercells on the same day, both capable of generating destructive tornadoes, and both directly impacting inhabited areas, is a scenario that borders on the extraordinary. Meteorologists agree that spring is the most dangerous season for the region. The combination of rising heat from the ground, moisture from the Indian Ocean, and cold winds at altitude creates fertile ground for intense storms. But even within that context, what happened in October 2011 exceeded expectations. It was as if nature had aligned every piece of the puzzle to unleash a double blow that few could have foreseen. Another relevant aspect is the lack of a detailed historical record. In countries with advanced monitoring technology, every tornado, no matter how small, is documented. In South Africa, the reality is different. Many rural communities lack nearby weather stations or radar, meaning that a large number of events are never officially reported. This leaves the question, have double outbreaks occurred before and simply gone unrecorded? The answer is uncertain, but what is clear is that never has an episode caused as much visible and media-driven devastation as Duduza and Vicksburg. Internationally, experts began to analyze the event as a case study. Scientific journals pointed out that the situation was a clear example of how climate change could be increasing the intensity and frequency of extreme events in places previously considered safe. The double tornado in South Africa was cited as evidence that weather patterns were becoming more erratic, and that the southern part of the continent should prepare for a more uncertain future. For ordinary residents, however, statistics mattered little at that moment. What they experienced was enough to be etched into the collective memory. A sky that split in two and unleashed twin monsters upon their cities. Something that until then seemed exclusive to international newscasts, to images from Oklahoma or Kansas, had happened in their own homes. The rarity of the event then can be explained in two dimensions. Meteorologically, it was an extraordinary coincidence of factors that rarely converge in South Africa. Socially, it was a brutal awakening to a new reality. The country was not safe from the destructive power of tornadoes. And if it happened once, it could happen again. The October 2011 outbreak left scientists with unanswered questions and the population with visible scars. Was it an isolated incident, the product of a unique combination of variables, or a sign that such phenomena could become more common? No one knows for sure. The only thing that is certain is that on that day, a new chapter in South Africa's climate history was written. When the wind unleashes with the force of a monster, it doesn't hit everyone equally. The tornadoes in Duduza and Vicksburg laid bare a painful truth. The poorest, the most vulnerable, always bear the brunt of tragedy. In Duduza, much of the population lived in informal settlements, with homes built through their own efforts and improvised materials. Hollow brick walls without foundations, tin roofs barely secured with rusty nails, windows covered with plastic or thin wood. In the face of a tornado, these structures were practically non-existent. The wind ripped them from the ground as if they had never been there. Entire families were suddenly left without a roof, without belongings, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The precariousness was no coincidence, but a reflection of decades of inequality. While in wealthier neighborhoods some homes were able to partially resist, in the settlements, the devastation was total. There, where life was already a daily struggle, the storm struck with the force of a judgment. Testimonies show how without warning or shelter, people improvised desperate strategies. Many ran to churches, considered safer because of their thick walls. Others threw themselves to the ground, covering themselves with blankets or mattresses, trying to protect themselves from flying debris. Some hid under tables or beds, clinging to anything that might give them a sense of safety. Amid the chaos, mothers hugged their children tightly, covering them with their own bodies. That survival instinct, more than any infrastructure, was what saved lives. In Vicksburg, although the homes were more solid on average, there were also vulnerable sectors. Farm workers and their families, who lived in simple houses near the fields, were the hardest hit. For them, the storm meant losing not only their roofs but also their livelihoods. Crops devastated, tools destroyed, and an uncertain future. Vulnerability is not measured only in material terms, but also in access to information. Without warning systems, sirens, or radio or television messages warning of danger, no one had the opportunity to prepare. What in other countries could have meant vital minutes to save lives simply didn't exist in South Africa. This lack of opportunity turned surprise into tragedy. The contrast was evident. While some survivors were able to rebuild their homes with insurance or their own resources, for those living in informal settlements, the loss was absolute. Without property titles or financial support, reconstruction became a slow and painful process, almost entirely dependent on humanitarian aid and the solidarity of neighbors and organizations. In the following days, makeshift shelters filled with people who had lost everything. Children slept on the floors of schools set up as emergency centers, while volunteers distributed blankets and hot meals. Amid the destruction, inequality became visible like never before. The Duduza and Vicksburg tornadoes didn't just destroy homes, they revealed a deeper lesson. In times of disaster, social fragility becomes a curse. And as extreme weather intensifies, the question is unavoidable. How many more communities will continue to be on the front lines of vulnerability? When the wind calmed and silence fell over Duduza and Vicksburg, What remained was a desolate landscape. Streets turned into piles of rubble, uprooted trees, twisted power poles, and roofs lost in the distance. The chaos of the storm gave way to a new challenge, rebuilding not only homes, but the hope of entire communities. The first to react were the neighbors themselves. Amidst dust and tears, they organized to rescue those trapped beneath the remains of collapsed walls. With their bare hands, improvised shovels, and courage fueled by urgency, men and women dug tirelessly. In many cases, they managed to save lives before emergency teams arrived. This spirit of solidarity was the first building block in the emotional reconstruction. Soon, official aid began to be deployed. Ambulances, firefighters, police, and rescue personnel arrived in the affected areas, although not always as quickly as the tragedy demanded. The collapse of communications and blocked roads delayed the arrival of reinforcements. However, when they finally gained access, the effort was massive. They set up emergency tents, distributed basic food supplies, and set up temporary shelters in schools and churches. At the same time, non-governmental organizations, churches, and community groups arrived. They brought blankets, clothing, bottles of water, and above all, words of encouragement to those who had lost everything. For many families, this solidarity was a beacon in the midst of darkness. Every gesture, every donation, every hot meal served became a reminder that they were not alone. Material reconstruction, however, was much slower and uneven. In Vicksburg, where part of the urban infrastructure held up, repairs began almost immediately. The local market, devastated by the wind, was back on its feet in a matter of months, driven by the efforts of merchants who needed to resume selling to survive. But in Duduza, the reality was different. There, the destroyed informal settlements had no legal backing or access to insurance. Families relied for months on humanitarian assistance and the slow government apparatus. The pain of loss was felt in every corner. Destroyed schools forced children to attend classes under makeshift tents. Overwhelmed hospitals struggled to care not only for those injured in the tornado, but also for regular patients in urgent need. Amid such need, the resilience of the people was what kept communities afloat. As the weeks passed, reflections also began. How had such a devastating storm struck without an early warning system in place? Why were the poorest homes doomed to disappear in a matter of seconds? And what could be done to ensure the future didn't repeat the same story? The answers didn't come immediately, but the disaster left an indelible lesson: the need to prepare. The Duduza and Vicksburg tornadoes demonstrated that South Africa was no stranger to extreme events that many thought were exclusive to other latitudes. If one thing was clear, it was that nature knows no boundaries, and that only prevention, investment in safe infrastructure, and community education could prevent a similar tragedy from happening again. The passage of the tornadoes through Duduza and Vicksburg not only left visible ruins, but also raised profound questions that had previously barely entered public conversation in South Africa. For decades, the idea that such violent phenomena could strike the country seemed distant, almost alien. Tornadoes were associated with the plains of the American Midwest, not with African villages. But after that disaster, that perception changed forever. Local meteorologists began to warn that the weather was displaying increasingly unpredictable patterns. Official records confirmed that in recent years, thunderstorms had become more intense, rainfall more erratic, and droughts longer. The contrast between flash floods and periods of extreme heat began to fit into a disturbing puzzle. South Africa's climate was entering a new era, one marked by instability. The tornado became, in that sense, a symbol of what was to come. The psychological impact on the population was enormous. Families who had never heard of tornadoes began to educate themselves, asking how they work, what signs announce their arrival, and above all, how to protect themselves. Schools invited experts to give educational talks, and news programs included segments dedicated to explaining the science behind these storms. The disaster had ignited a collective interest in meteorology that until then seemed reserved for a few specialists. The government, pressured by the magnitude of the tragedy, began considering unprecedented measures. There was talk of installing early warning systems inspired by those in North America, capable of detecting supercells and providing precious minutes of warning. Debates also arose over the quality of construction. Why did so many homes collapse so quickly? The answer was clear. Substandard materials and a lack of robust regulations had turned settlements into death traps in the face of extreme winds. From this, the idea of promoting safer building standards was born, although the country's economic reality made immediate implementation difficult. At the same time, the disaster was used as an example by environmental activists who had already been warning about the effects of climate change. They pointed out that phenomena of this magnitude could not be understood as simple isolated accidents, but rather as part of a global scenario in which the atmosphere, altered by human activity, was responding with increasing violence. Their messages found fertile ground. The population, still bearing fresh scars, was willing to listen. Thus, little by little, the tornado in Duduza and Vicksburg transcended the category of natural disaster to become a catalyst for climate awareness. It wasn't just about rebuilding collapsed homes, but about rethinking the country's relationship with nature. Farmlands, cities, and even development plans began to be seen in a new light. The wind had slashed roofs, but it had also opened a window onto an uncertain future that demanded immediate responses. In this tension between tragedy and opportunity, a new chapter in South African history was born, the awakening of a collective consciousness in the face of the power of the climate. If you want to continue exploring the planet's most extreme phenomena, learn about the power of tornadoes, and discover shocking nature stories, subscribe to our Extreme Tornado channel. Ring the bell so you don't miss any storms. Share these stories with your friends and get ready. The next monster in the sky could be closer than you think.